I am in the Simpich home today with 3 portraits of my Aunt Evelyn Jane, and 2 of them were portrayed by my mother with the Simpich character dolls. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my mother's family. Her parents, Dr. Charles Nixon and Brenda Nixon, raised their family in Independence, Missouri. And my mother was their oldest child. She was born in 1933. And my granddaddy practiced medicine in the Independence area, and as their family grew, they had several homes in that area, which unfortunately my wife Debbie and I have had a chance to only see from the outside. But we've had a lot of inside pictures from or images of their growing up, or my mother's growing up, through photographs and of course stories. Their second child was Charles Nixon Jr., and my grandparents nicknamed him Sonny, and he passed away when he was still very young, just around a year old. Shortly after, they had another son whose name was Bob Nixon, and he now resides in Connecticut. And then came the twins, and I have to say they were my Nana Nix, my grandmother's pride and joy, Evelyn Jane and Marcia Ann. Evelyn Jane was named after my granddaddy's sister, and Marcia Ann was named after my Nana Nick's sister. But from the time they were born, I guess it was just basically just shortly after their delivery, my Nana Nick decided she was going to call them Midge and Pudge. Pudge was Evelyn Jane and Midge was Marcia Ann. And within our family, those names have stuck. So actually what I have here are 3 portraits of my Aunt Pudge. And it's an interesting name because, you know, she was a very elegant lady, but with my mother and my Aunt Midge, and with my Nana Nick part of the time, the name Pudge stuck. So talking about these portraits here. Well, it actually began, the story of these portraits began in 1984. My wife Debbie and I were newlyweds and living in the Seattle area in Issaquah, Washington, and we had the only official family outlet of the Simpich character dolls, a little tiny shop in Gilman Village in Issaquah, Washington. And we were just getting that shop underway. I was exploring marionette puppetry for the first time in 1984. And one day I received a call from my mother, and she and my dad had some very serious news about my Aunt Pudge. She was coming down with a very serious case of cancer in her sinuses, and they told her that she only had maybe 3 or 4 months to live, so it kind of rocked our whole family. At that time, my Aunt Pudge was living in Texas and had raised 2 boys who were in high school age, and was married to a dentist, and they were happily married there, so our whole family had this shockwave of what was happening to my Aunt Evelyn Jane. And of course, we didn't know how to respond, and began praying. My mother and my Aunt Midge, and then of course Nana Nick, went to Texas to be with the family as much as possible, and my mother would call and give me details about the progression of the cancer. And sure enough, it took her life within 3 months. And again, it just rocked our whole family, you know, and it's been over 35 years now, but we can still remember that time vividly. And as is often the case with an artist, the first way to respond to something like that is to try to express it through art. And I know very shortly after Pudge's passing, my mother did a portrait head of her sister Pudge. And they weren't sure if they were going to make that into a Simpich doll, but my mother expressed that love for her sister through that portrait, had the head just on hand to see if a doll might present itself to be made of my aunt. Well, in 1988, the U.S. Women's Figure Skating Championship asked my parents to design a skater doll to present to the winners of the championship, which was going to take place in Denver in 1988. So it was decided that they would use my Aunt Pudge's portrait as the head for the Victorian skater. So my parents designed this piece. My mother worked out a bonnet that Evelyn Jane would wear, and worked out an elaborate Victorian costume. And then I know that actually the skates were the big challenge here. My brother Reg sculpted a pair of skates which they eventually cast in pewter, so they were strong enough. They worked out a block of ice, and it was quite a project to work out this piece. And then the winners of the championship received this skater doll as just a special present for competing in the championship. And as a little bonus, they also gave the Simpich family and some of the workers that had worked on the doll tickets to see the championship, and it was at McNichols Arena in Denver in the early part of 1988. So we got to go and see that championship before. Let me see, I have a list here. Debbie Thomas and Jill Trenery and Karen Kadavi and Jerry Campbell were the winners of the championship in Denver, and then they quickly went on to compete in the Olympics that year. So that was a very exciting thing for our family, to have this doll presented to the champions. And then it was put in production at the Simpich doll shop at that time. And a few years later, my mother decided she would do another Victorian piece based on my Aunt Pudge, and designed the Victorian summer piece. Now this particular one has blonde hair, but they also did the dark hair. I have to say the dark hair has always been my favorite because it looks like my Aunt Pudge. But they've done all kinds of fabric. They did all kinds of fabrics through the years to do the Victorian summer, and it's been a very important and special piece. They worked out a parasol, kind of elaborate pieces, and then my brother adapted her shoes. I'll show you the shoes here. Very elegant little boots. And so a wonderful piece too. I have to say though that my family was very haunted by that period of time when we were losing my Aunt Pudge, and my wife and I were living in Washington, and we felt very far from everything that was happening down in Texas. And my mother would call and talk to me about the way Pudge was responding to the fact that she was losing her battle with this strange sinus cancer, and would say that it seemed that just the things of the world, the stuff of the world, was just kind of becoming less and less important to Pudge with each passing day. And close to the time of her death, all she would talk about was the kingdom. And it just impressed my mother. It impressed my grandmother, my Aunt Midge. Of course, her beloved twin was losing her sister. And all Pudge would talk about would be that she was going to inherit the kingdom, and the things of the world just weren't important to her. And she seemed to be just anticipating and preparing herself. And we were all left with that. That she was seeking first the kingdom of God right at the time of her death. And that has stuck with me. It was hard to be so far away. I wasn't able to attend her funeral, but it was an important legacy that she left right at the end of her life, that there was nothing more important than just the kingdom. And it was interesting, my mother as an artist responded to that by creating an object. But art has a way of transcending that for the artist and for the ones that look at pieces of art. And I know for my family, and also for the people that have collected the Simpich dolls. This is a very special portrait of elegance. You know, perhaps the name Pudge is mostly meaningful to our family. She was a very elegant lady. But I would say that my mother left a very important portrait of someone that my family loved very much. So it's a very important piece to all of us.